Welcome back, everybody. You're joining the Web 3.0 stage of CogX 2020. This stage is run by Fabric Ventures VC. And we hope for those who've just joined us, this morning, that you're enjoying yourselves and you had a good break and you've got, a cup of coffee or tea, and you're going to enjoy the next hour where we've got a presentation by Trent McConaghy, co-founder of Ocean Protocol, speaking on the coronavirus trilemma, when democracy meets pandemics. And right after his presentation, there'll be a panel discussion led by Jemima Kelly from the FT. So as we just lead into Trent's presentation, I'd just like to give you just a brief overview of Trent and Ocean Protocol. So Ocean Protocol is aiming to democratize data for use in privacy and AI. And Trent did AI research for 2 decades, including machine creativity and AI to help drive Moore's Law. So I hope you'll enjoy the presentation. And yeah, over to you, Trent.
Thank you very much for having me here at CogX, and hello everyone out there in the virtual world or the real world connected virtually, whatever it is. And yeah, let's get started. So I'm going to start the title of my talk, which points to this trade-off we have among 3 objectives: the objectives of safety, privacy, and the economy. Pick any 2. And so that's the question. Do we have to pick just 2, or can we get away with everything? So if we rewind to December of last year, we had things like this market in Wuhan, China. Just at the time, it was pretty standard. Back then in China, even going back many, many years, people wear masks, and this is simply a market there. But this is how things were in Wuhan in December of last year. And within the span of about 4 weeks, it changed to this. Well, this isn't Wuhan, of course, this is elsewhere, but 4 weeks later, 8 weeks later, etc., coronavirus spread throughout the world. And we had basically, places deserted everywhere because of social distancing to help slow the spread of this pandemic. So we went from, the status quo as we knew it to sort of a potentially new status quo, or at least, our brains think it's the status quo right now. So that's where we're at. We've got this pandemic happening. And China itself was the first to move to take action because, well, of course, this thing grew exponentially. And they moved to take action with a lot of surveillance in various forms to basically track where any potential carrier might be of the coronavirus, to test aggressively, and with social distancing and many other things, basically to try to stop this coronavirus in its tracks. And it was, by and large, quite successful. The number of new cases dropped dramatically, and in China, and there's lots of numbers to back this up. But the question is, at what cost? So overall, you can summarize the challenges that China and other places face. In China, there was this move to bring back the safety, which was basically social distancing and all of this, such that the coronavirus stopped basically killing people. And at the same time, though, if you have full lockdown like Wuhan had and elsewhere, then it is devastating to the economy, right? So China's approach was to have massive surveillance, like I mentioned, and then once safety got in place, then to do things to start kickstarting the economy. In its case, with turning manufacturing back on, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of how China approached coronavirus in broad brushstrokes, right? With the social contract that China roughly has with its citizens, this is even potentially okay in China. But a lot of the West, of course, has different views of privacy. To quote Benjamin Franklin, those who would give up essential safety to purchase a little temporary liberty deserve neither liberty nor safety. This is a very, Western view, and of course, many Western ideals derive from Ben Franklin, the man, and obviously many other people that are sort of philosopher thinkers that helped to construct democracies hundreds of years ago, the first democracies. So this is basically what China ended up with. But the question is, what about the rest of the world? The UK decided, let's basically try to keep our economy going. And let's, they didn't have to worry about privacy and how to do it. Go for this concept of herd immunity. And there was a lot of discussion about this, where basically they were looking at not doing massive lockdowns. But fortunately, there was very big pushback in the press internationally, as well as by the people themselves. And in the end, the lockdown still happened. So there wasn't, this massive push to herd immunity. Of course, if that happened, then the hospitals would have been overwhelmed, and there would have been really big problems. And of course, we've seen in many nations, the hospitals did get overwhelmed, including Wuhan in the early days, including in Italy and other places. Fortunately, UK didn't move towards this. Sweden moved a bit towards this, unlike its Nordic neighbors, where they didn't lock down nearly as heavily. And if you look at their relative death tolls, et cetera, compared to their neighbors, it's been quite a lot worse. So this was basically, if you think about it, there was choosing to keep the economy going, hurting the safety of the citizens. And because there wasn't a push towards the safety in a big way, then privacy laws, et cetera, didn't really change. So this is sort of taking, a different two of these three. A third way, which we're seeing in Germany, where I'm based, and many other Western nations, is definitely go for safety. So, try to keep the number of infections, et cetera, sufficiently low, such that the hospitals don't get overwhelmed. Because if they get overwhelmed, then the death rate spikes. Germany, as most of the audience I'm sure knows, Germany is very strong with respect to its privacy laws and rules. It had laws before GDPR. The German laws influenced GDPR, these general data protection regulations that have been rolled out across Europe. But of course, in going for safety, in doing things like lockdowns in particular, then businesses could not run as normal. So it's really been hard on the economy. A lot of jobs have been lost, et cetera, et cetera. This isn't just isn't just Germany either. It's a lot of Western nations. USA has had tens of millions of jobs lost due to this lockdown and stuff, for example. So it looks like we're at this sort of dilemma. We have these three things that we want to aim for: safety, economy, and privacy. But it looks like we're only going to get two. And you might ask also, it's really worth going back to Ben Franklin on the privacy, like, why is privacy so important? And the answer is privacy is critical to democracy. For democracies to stay legitimate, government's power must be kept in check by citizens. Citizens need the ability to gather in private, to organize protests, to speak out. They shouldn't need to worry about the government tracking every movement, monitoring who they meet, and curtailing free speech. So, overall, state surveillance, you can view it as a moral hazard. Gone unchecked, it can lead to sort of big brother authoritarian regimes. So that's why privacy is so critical. And, that's why Germany, of course, wants to maintain it, and many Western nations. It's really strongly tied to democracy itself. So here's the goal: to have all three, right? Can we have our cake and eat it too, if you will? And overall, I'm an engineer, and in engineering, we're often confronted with trade-offs of two or three or more things. So a triangle is simply a way of visualizing a trade-off among three things. In this case, safety, economy, and privacy. Some have called it the coronavirus trilemma. I've also published a piece even before those days calling it the pandemic triangle. Whatever the label, basically there's a trade-off among these three things. Now, here's the cool news. When you have trade-offs in engineering, if you're sneaky about it, sometimes you can break the trade-off. Sometimes it isn't some sort of fundamental trade-off. So, for example, in the world of decentralization, there is a frameless triangle called Zuko's triangle, where it's a network where names are ideally human meaningful, secure, and decentralized. And traditionally, you can only pick any two. But then famously, Aaron Swartz squared this triangle using blockchain technology. And there's other triangles as well. For example, in project management, there's this thing called the scope triangle, where there's a trade-off in cost, time, and quality. Pick any two. So here, we've got a trade-off in safety, economy, and privacy / democracy. Pick any two. Or is there a trade-off, right? Can we be sneaky about it? Can we pull an Aaron Swartz and try to square this triangle? That's the question. So if we think about it, first of all, maybe there's some tactics that we can sort of use epistemically to approach this that are just pragmatic things that don't compromise on anything. And so I'm just going to run through a list of some of these. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on any of this. It's more about the idea of trying things that have bounded downside negatives, but potentially big upside positives. So sort of Nicholas Nassim Taleb type thinking. So here's a few, right? First of all, don't do stupid stuff. And I'll give a list of this. And you might think, of course, that's obvious, but we've seen actually actions from governments that still isn't the brightest. And then, yeah, like I mentioned, do things that have bounded downside and potentially big upside, and stack them together and see what we can get coming out of that. So, for example, here's some stupid stuff to avoid. Don't hold a protest against coronavirus, right? You got, 1,000, 10,000 people shoulder to shoulder, potentially not wearing masks, claiming it's needed for liberty or something. This is probably not the wisest move. Also, probably not very smart to call it a hoax, because that's misleading your citizens in the wrong direction. And then you end up with, more people dead than from previous, like Vietnam War and stuff like that. Also, probably not a good idea to suppress testing just so that it looks good to keep your case numbers low. Exponentials like this don't care, right? The pandemic virus, it's not listening to the news. It's not hearing what leaders are saying. It's just replicating. So these case numbers are going to blow up anyway. And, you can just simply look at the death count, et cetera. Probably also not a good idea to withdraw funding from health agencies, and also not a good idea to encourage your citizens to go out. I pointed all of these because if we rewind 8 weeks, we would have all said, yeah, this looks very silly. Why would anyone do this? But we have seen governments doing this because incentives haven't been quite aligned with the safety of their citizens, unfortunately. Here's some other low-hanging fruit along the lines of, doing things with bounded downsides and potentially big upside. It's no risk at all, basically, to wear a mask. Or if there is, that somehow I haven't heard about it, super minimal. But by doing that, you're greatly reducing the chance of getting infected from someone else, as well as greatly reducing the chance of infecting someone else. So, for example, pretty early on, in mid-March, the Czech Republic was one of the very first countries to mandate the use of masks. And the citizens of the Czech Republic got sewing. And they managed to really keep a lot of the spread at bay. And that helped a lot. So this is just something, once again, minimal downside, potentially big upside. And this was, at the time, flying in the face from recommendations of the WHO and others, which were basically trying to keep the masks for safety of the health workers. But overall, once again, exponentials, they don't care. And if you can prevent the spread, then you end up, avoiding these exponentials proceeding. So masks is a good idea. Another one, which we've seen a lot of talk about, is privacy-preserving technology. So contact tracing. We've seen proposals from the big mobile OS vendors like Apple and Google working together. That's one of the things, right, where it has, and it can do it in a way that's trying to preserve privacy. So you can basically see, if you get coronavirus, well, who were you in contact with in the last 2 weeks? And then there can be some privacy-preserving technology to help ensure that data is shared in a way that's actionable, yet at the same time minimizing the leakage of personally identifiable information that can be used against you. And it's not just contact tracing; it kind of goes across the board. For example, hospitals themselves are trying to figure out how to, and researchers are trying to do vaccines. And usually, when a lot of this is very data-driven, where you're building AI models. So if you can have an AI model that can do predictions of how useful a therapy is, or even what's the chance of someone having coronavirus, then the more data you have, the better. But of course, the more data you have, then if this data is all visible to researchers, et cetera, then it opens up attack vectors for people to potentially misuse that personally identifiable information. The cool thing is there's a lot of technology out there that's emerging where you can merge together the data in ways where you can build AI models and where you can build the AI models without compromising the privacy. As sort of a quick laundry list, there's things like federated learning, homomorphic encryption, bringing compute to the data, simple encryption and decryption, multi-party compute, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where I spend my days, so I'm quite familiar with it, of course. Another one, of course, is aggressive testing. So like drive-through testing. This is an example from Germany. And maybe a good one simply is Be Taiwan, right? Taiwan is an example of a country that was exposed very early to potentially a lot of cases. And they were very aggressive in rolling out tactics. By one count, 124 different tactics that basically did all of the above. They had masks, they had really good contact tracing, they had really good testing, et cetera, through the whole sort of life cycle of the coronavirus. And even how they approached it, they managed to keep the privacy concerns quite low because of how they approach things. So being Taiwan is a pretty good starting point. And so to conclude, basically with will, I believe that all three are possible. We can have safety, economy, and privacy. We don't have to compromise. We don't have to necessarily trash the economy as time goes on, or trash safety, or trash privacy. We can have all three. And of course, we're farther along now than when I initially wrote this article. But it still matters, because as we look to reboot our economies, we can do it in a way where we don't compromise privacy or safety. So I will stop there. And thank you, everyone, for watching.
Thank you very much, Trent, for that presentation. It was a great note to end on. So yeah, I guess for those who have questions for Trent, do pop them on the box on the side of the screen. I'm sure you'll see that there's a Q&A poll. There will be a Q&A session starting at 1 p.m. UK time. So if you just pop them there, I'm sure Trent will be able to answer them. And now, on to the next panel discussion. I'd like to hand over the virtual stage to the moderator for this session, which is Jemima Kelly, a journalist at the FT who writes for FT Alphaville. At the moment, her work is focused mainly on coronavirus, but she also often writes about blockchain, fintech, and technology more broadly. I always look forward to your blog posts. So yeah, over to you, Jemima.
Cool, thank you. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this panel. That was a really nice introduction, I think, from Trent, because he's basically given us a presentation about what we're going to be discussing, which is when democracy meets pandemics, and this trilemma that he's talked about between those three things. So can I introduce everyone? So we've got Trent back. Hi, Trent. And then we have Santiago, Siri, and Puja Ohlhaver. Is that how I pronounce your surname?
Ohlhaver.
Ohlhaver. Hi. So I think we've had an introduction to Trent, but do the other two of you want to just briefly introduce yourselves and maybe just give us like a few words about how your work might be kind of overlapping into, how you're kind of working on coronavirus as well, or not just the actual virus. Let me rephrase that. How your work is kind of into this kind of the crisis that we now face, or several crises. Do you want to start, Puja?
Well, I can jump on that.
No, sure. Go for it, Santiago. You can start. Do you want to just introduce yourself and tell us how your work relates to this?
Yes, I'm Santiago Siri. I'm one of the founders of Democracy Earth. We're a non-profit organization that is trying to understand democracy in the information age. Boils down to understanding what key technologies are required in order to deploy democracies anywhere there's an internet connection, democracies that are free, that are open source, and that are censorship resistant. So we do a lot of research in the blockchain space. And of course, during COVID, it has been really interesting to watch how it has impacted the adoption of new technology. In particular, I work very closely with another project called Open Collective, and I have seen over the last 2-3 months a lot of collectives which are virtual organizations that have been created to help those in need and to coordinate efforts to assist doctors and those that are on the trenches fighting the virus. And in regards to blockchain technology, I think it remains to be seen more adoption of the tech itself in terms of usability, but there's also interest in distributed autonomous organizations and stuff like that. That's what we work on Democracy Earth.
Okay, cool. What about you, Puja?
Hi, so I'm a CEO of ClearPath Surgical, and relevant to this discussion, I'm also a collaborator with the Edmund J. Salfer Center for Ethics at Harvard in their roadmap to pandemic resilience. And this is an initiative that's led by Daniel Allen, which has also now joined forces with the Harvard School of Public Health, led by Ashish Jha. I'm a co-author to the recent report, Getting It Done, which outlines a testing, tracing, and supported isolation strategy. We call it TTSI, to suppress prevalence down to close to zero. And the goal of this South Fraud suppression plan is to restore a free society with a pandemic resilient economy, where people feel safe to go to work, schools, and churches without fearing outbreaks, and ultimately to sidestep this trilemma that you've been discussing.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much. So maybe I could start by asking the two of you, Puja and Santiago, whether you have any kind of immediate responses to what Trent has just outlined.
Sure. I'll go first. So, the trilemma of safety, economy, and privacy, it's in US terms, since I'm an American, we frame that as a debate between lives, liberties, and livelihoods. And my view is that this trade-off really is a false choice, and framing it in terms of trade-offs doesn't really consider the alternatives beyond lockdown or no lockdowns and rampant disease spread. There's a third alternative, which Trent alluded to by referencing Taiwan, and that alternative is testing, tracing, and supported isolation. Taiwan never went through a lockdown. Their economy grew 1.59% in the first quarter, whereas the UK's economy declined by 1.6%. What Taiwan and what other countries like South Korea have done, and now what other countries like New Zealand, Australia, and Germany, and hopefully the United States soon will be doing, is TTSI. And what TTSI means is testing, first of all, testing all symptomatics, not just for therapeutic purposes, but also diagnostic purposes. It also means tracing, and tracing not just all the contacts of a positive, but also all those positive contacts down a chain of transmission until there are zero positives. And then there's the isolation prong, and countries have had different approaches to this. But for the SAFRA plan, and for me, isolation means voluntary isolation and paying the sick voluntarily to isolate at hotels if needed with health support. So this is the general view of the TTSI strategy. And we think that if we implement this, not just in the United States, but in the UK, we can restore our free societies with a pandemic resilient economy, where people feel safe, and we can ultimately drive the virus prevalence to zero through suppression tactics.
All right, brilliant, thank you. I think that's interesting because you've framed it in a slightly different way, and the use of lives, livelihood. What was the third one? Lives, livelihood, and
liberty. American
liberty. That's the one. That's the one I wanted to talk about, because it seems to me that the trilemma slightly leaves out that fourth prong. And because you can have privacy without necessarily having your civil liberties, which is what we've had massively restricted in the UK and the US. And a lot of people don't think that's okay, given that the unknowns of the virus are still so extreme. And yes, as Trent said, Sweden has had higher death numbers, but it hasn't been the kind of apocalypse that many people feared. And ultimately, it might have had higher death numbers now, but like in the long run, will the negative effects of the lockdown outweigh the positives? So, and will therefore somewhere like Sweden actually, end up better off? I mean, obviously it's extremely hard to compare because we have completely different demographics in all these countries, not to say different ways of counting things. And obviously it's not like they're operating in a bubble, like they're being affected by what we're all doing elsewhere as well. So it's not like they're just kind of carrying on like their normal lives. But I wondered whether Trent or Santiago, what you think about this, where that fits in the kind of liberty part of it, because it seems to me that isn't really considered in this trilemma. Maybe that's one for you, Trent. Like, where does that fit in? Because it seems like that's a big big issue that I think a lot of Westerners have in terms of trying to emulate what countries in Asia have done. I think, you know, the West feels, particularly like, you know, particularly the right and the centre right in the UK and US would feel that kind of our civil liberties are one of the most important things that we have, and that makes us stand out from other countries in Asia, for example. Where does that fit in, Trent?
Yeah, actually, well, I see it that it bundles into the privacy part, and this is why when I'm talking about privacy, I talked about how privacy is essential to a democracy, right? And a democracy has freedom, right? And so to me, it's not even a question of whether you should be trading off freedom or not. You have to maintain your freedom, right? But it's sort of a given that way, but there can be trade-offs on the privacy side, but there should not be, you know, trade-offs, or you should really minimize the trade-offs on the freedom side, because that's simply a given.
I don't know if it's a given though, is it? Because we're living in the most restrict, you know, our civil liberties have been taken away from us to a kind of unprecedented extent at the moment. So it's not, I don't know if it's a given, and I don't know if it can be grouped in with privacy, because being locked indoors isn't necessarily restricting our privacy, is it?
Well, okay, but fair point. And so I guess, you know, in my conception of it, they're locked in, but you can unlock it, or like in my conception, they're bound together. But if you like, yes, you can unbundle them. And yeah, maybe in my conception, I just bundle it too tightly, but it's definitely worth discussing on its own. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Santiago, did you have anything to add on that?
No, I was able to. I am Argentine. This whole situation found me in February in a vacation in Argentina. So I stayed in my country doing quarantine there for 2 months, and I got back to Spain, where I live, a month ago. So I've been following the conversation patterns in Argentina and in Spain and around the world, in the US, and through social media, pretty much anywhere. And the weirdest element of this whole thing is how ideological it's getting, where you see a clear pattern on right-wing populist governments taking certain type of measures or lack of measures, whereas probably other governments being much more restricted on the civil liberties. There's even a term that it became popular in Argentina to describe that, you know, Argentina started a very strong early quarantine, and they're calling it now an infectorship. A mix of infection and dictatorship, and it's, to me, it's surreal to see something that should be addressed under scientific means. It's a massive situation going on in the world. How ideological it can get very fast, and how, you know, even in Spain, I have seen civil disobedience acts, massive rallies called by the far right to disobey the quarantine. The March of Freedom, they call it that way, while we're having a socialist government here that is, you know, Spain was Madrid especially was one of the most affected cities in the world from this virus. So even though the situation is very hard at a personal level for a lot of people here, it still gets people divided. And you see governments where in Argentina, actually, the opposition is willing to collaborate with the official government, whereas in Spain, the opposition is completely, you know, attacking the government for every single measure they take. And this split in politics is also, hijacking some of the efforts that are being made to address the virus. And it's incredible that, you know, in the age of technology and science, you know, politics permeates even the most urgent and pressing situations.
Is that incredible? I mean, like, the science is so unclear on this. Like, none of the scientists agree. They're all arguing over it. Right. Some people think that there's immunological matter, and that basically, you know, 80% of people are not going to get it, and other people think that, you know, the infection fatality rate, is above 1, and some people think it's like 0.2, which percent this is, so that makes a massive difference in terms of the number of deaths. People disagree on the reproduction number. They disagree on whether the virus has somehow mutated into something more benign. I mean, they continue. So I think it's difficult to say that, like, politics are permeating. The thing is, they are in charge, and, you know, like, people are it's funny how in some ways people are getting upset by the way in which the governments are dealing with this. It's like they can't do something that affects me, even though, you know, we live in a system that kind of gives these people power. So we have given them power, and I guess it's inevitable that politics are going to come into this when the science is all still kind of up in the air. And I don't know whether, I mean, you talked about technology. I mean, are these issues that we're talking about really issues that can be resolved by technology, or are they more kind of structural issues? Even if you look at the kind of issues that you have with like contact tracing, is that really a technological thing that needs to be solved? I mean, sure, we need some technology, but there seems to me that there's some kind of structural issue. Even things like, you know, in the UK, for example, I know that, for example, this swabbing, when you're testing yourself, you put the swab in your throat, or through your nose and into your throat, and apparently that doesn't pick up as much viral matter as if you were to be tested in your lungs. So your lungs contain more of the viral matter, for example. So it could give you a false negative, for example. And then there's the fact of the timing and people not sending the tests back in time. Blah blah. There's all these kind of structural issues, and I'm not sure what the role is. I mean, how much of a role does technology have here? I mean, this is a tech conference, so we should.
Well, I have a couple of things to say. So, first of all, I think it's very dangerous to be fatalistic, saying just because there's uncertainty in the science, therefore we should ignore the science, or ignore whatever science has given us for guidance, right? So that's the first part, and we're actually seeing that. And the second thing related is it's pretty clear that many government actions have not been helpful to the safety of the people, right? There's actions that could have been done in the early days that help the safety of the people, help keep the economy on track, don't affect privacy, and these actions weren't taken. And instead, governments cast blame. Fortunately, that's only some governments. And even now, those same governments aren't taking blame or taking responsibility, right? So this goes back to like what I mentioned in my initial talk, like don't do stupid stuff. And we keep seeing governments doing stupid stuff. This is completely independent of science or technology, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And so in terms of then, like, I think we all have responsibilities as citizens to do what we can ourselves. We should be taking responsibility for our own lives and then that of our family and stuff around us. But then we can also ask, what can we do for the people around us, like more and more broadly in the community and so on. And, at the highest government levels as well. And also, see that, over time, technology can help to address this, right? Technology is always a double-edged sword, but here it's pretty clear, as Puja pointed out, I'm sure she has details too, on how we can resolve this three-way trade-off by leveraging technology in the right ways. So, let's not be fatalistic just because it looks like this a trade-off, and this is what the news is telling us. There isn't necessarily a trade-off if we're not stupid about it.
Right.
I think just to respond to that, I mean, I wasn't trying to be fatalistic or to say that we should ignore the science. That would be ridiculous. I was saying that I think Santiago was saying that politics is coming in when it should only be about science and technology, when I was saying, well, that's a bit difficult because the politicians are the people who have to make the decisions. They are the people who we've bestowed with that power. They are being given conflicting advice from scientists, and they ultimately are therefore having to make those decisions. I mean, the chief scientific advisors and the chief medical officers can tell them what they think, and that's presumably, there are in the UK, for example,
Yes, but we shouldn't just because they get different advice from their different advisors. We should not give them a get out of jail free card for them taking responsibility, right? Not. Because it's pretty clear that the incentives. Yeah, it's pretty clear that
wrong. They're getting lots wrong, and it's clear that and they're flailing around miserably. But I'm just wondering whether, because I know you wrote this piece on the Trilemma, for example, back in March, I think, and I get it. Like maybe they didn't need to be. Maybe we and I like this whole "don't do stupid stuff" idea. Like that's a good idea for just life in general that people should adopt a lot more. And but I think it's a bit late now to say clearly we're going to need inquiries into government failings, and clearly there have been lots of government failings. Some of those have been the government's fault. Some of those have been the fact that the scientists weren't I'm talking about the UK specifically, perhaps the scientists didn't think big enough, didn't think, for example, in the UK that in the UK, if you look at the SAGE minutes, it's clear that the scientists at that stage didn't think that a lockdown was feasible. It's easy for us to say now with hindsight, like, why didn't we lock down? Like, China was locked down, Italy started lockdown. When Italy locked down, we were all extremely shocked by it. Like, it was the most insane thing, and we've kind of accepted it as a given now. Of course we'll lock down if we've got a pandemic, but it was like quite a kind of radical idea for these kind of for a kind of Western democracy to adopt such a policy. So I think the scientists as well, back at the start, were kind of a little bit hesitant about recommending that. But there's all sorts of kind of people who we can blame. But right now, it seems that it might have been false trade-offs, but now we have the situation that we have, where we do have thousands of deaths and hundreds of thousands of cases or millions of cases globally. And so I guess it's a kind of, we now have to face with that. But just to go into the technology, you said, Puja, maybe Trent said that maybe you could talk a bit about this. So what can the technology do here? And you because you talked as well, Trent, about this privacy preserving tech, without kind of giving us some specifics. Can we get some specifics on the technology that would be really useful here? Yeah.
Sure, but let me just comment on some of the points you made. There is a lot of uncertainty in science, but that's precisely the reason why we should have an approach to suppress the virus and just drive it down to zero prevalence. And it's not too late, even though we have hundreds of thousands of cases. It certainly is not too late if you have a surge in testing and tracing. And this is actually where politics does meet science. So for example, in the United States, we have about 400,000 to 700,000 tests a day. In order to do a surge in testing, we need to get that to millions a day. And the best way to do that is actually for the government to spend money and encourage manufacturers to produce more tests through different incentives. And we've explored different ways to do that using regional interstate compacts. So there is a role for politics here, and the uncertainty in science should not stop us from trying to suppress the virus and restore our lives to normal. So that being said, yes, there is a role for technology. There's also a role for basic standard disease control. So TTSI, testing, tracing, isolation. This is a standard practice. This is not a novel idea. And manual contact tracing, which is low tech, is absolutely critical to that, especially for contexts that are very intimate, one-on-one interactions, rural areas that don't have huge population prevalence, huge population density, and also that may lack access to technology. There was a report actually by the Financial Times that 2 billion cell phones in the world couldn't even plug into the iOS/Google framework or operating system, or has a requisite low energy Bluetooth chip in it, so it doesn't run down the battery of your phone when you're doing contact tracing on your phone. So manual contact tracing is critical. It's essential. It's been, it was done in Taiwan and South Korea. Taiwan manually contact traced the first 100 cases, and that was critical to their suppression, and that's the reason why they only have 400 cases. That said, technology can be useful in certain contexts, and particularly that context are public spaces, right? I mean, it's very difficult for a manual contact tracer to go into to track an outbreak that's happened in a subway car, or that's happened in a confined plaza. So in those public spaces, technology contact tracing tools could be useful, but what we really need to do is be careful about, as Trent alluded to, the privacy preserving aspects of it. My view is there's a lot of promise in the Bluetooth peer-to-peer technology. I think what Apple and Google have rolled out, that's relied on the TCN coalition and DP3T protocols. That has actually gone very far in privacy preserving technology. But the trick is actually getting people to voluntarily download those apps without forcing them to do it. And we've seen a challenge in that uptake in places like Iceland and Australia and Singapore that have tried to roll that out.
Can you just talk about the Bluetooth thing? What's the Bluetooth thing that you said was promising?
So there's different ways to do contact tracing using an app. There's different models. There's relying on GPS data, so that's your location histories, and then there's peer-to-peer, what's called exposure notifications, using Bluetooth signals. So like my Bluetooth signal interacts with your Bluetooth signal, and I believe Apple and Google, right there, the platform they've developed is our Bluetooth signals are generating these random numbers, so it's anonymized. And that model, there's sort of a consensus around that model is the most privacy preserving, because GPS location histories, you can eventually trace where that location history goes back to, where that the house the person eventually keeps going back to. So the experiments in the United States, 3 states have signed on for Bluetooth GPS, Bluetooth peer-to-peer exposure warning apps. COVID Watch is, I think, doing a great job on this. It's run by Tina White, and she's out of Stanford. But we've yet to actually see, these apps roll out. They're really in their early stage phases. And relied on Bluetooth. It only got 20% adoption because it was running down the battery of phones. It required the phones to be on at all times. Australia, I believe, they only got like 6 million out of 25 million people. And what you need is 40 to 60% of the population to use one of these apps in order for it to be effective.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. Maybe Santiago, one for you. Obviously one of the main worries about the kind of response to the pandemic is that it will be used to kind of justify a massive increase in executive power in various countries and a massive fall in freedoms. What do you think that's how big of an issue is that, and are there any other, which kind of countries would you be kind of most concerned about that happening?
I think it's the main criticism coming from the right wing anywhere. The Chinese virus, right? The consequences more than from the biological layer to the political layer is, surveillance now has an excuse to advance in every aspect of society. I think we're still in the middle of the storm. It's very hard to gain perspective and really understand what's going on. Everyone, at least in my lifetime, it's the first time that I see absolutely the entire world, other than the World Cup or other events like that, and the entire world talking about the same issue, facing the same problem. We have this, this curve metric, this benchmark that is applied to every country and is being used to evaluate not only our own country, but how our country compares with other countries. In Argentina, for example, everyone is comparing the performance on how we are tackling the virus with Brazil or Chile and Europe or the US or China itself. Is China telling the truth? Are they not telling the truth? So for there's this mutation of society in a more abstract layer of things that is really interesting, that the world is engaging in the most global conversation we ever had as a global civilization, as a global society. And in that sense, is the world that we seem to be engaging after this virus is going to be definitely a much more connected world in a very strange way, where we have more virtual proximity than ever, with more physical distancing than ever. That's another interesting, situation that the virus has changed in our lives. Everyone, how engaging with events and conference and through video conferencing almost in our routine, our daily life, has really disrupted our way of life, our way of working. The impact this will have on industries like real estate. There's a lot of transformation that's going to happen in the social economic aspect. I can only hope for the world having a much more awareness of the world itself, rather than sticking strictly to the local politics of every country. This is a situation we have seen in the last 2 months. The growth of e-commerce is equivalent to the growth of e-commerce in the last 10 years. If this is only going to happen in commerce, or is it going to even advance in other areas? The adoption of cryptocurrency or cryptographic protocols, for the adoption of new waves of technologies, virtual reality. All of this stuff is where we seem to be in some kind of leapfrog, where the acceleration of technologies that were already coming very fast, now they have significantly accelerated their adoption. More than, I have no memory of something like this happening, and I try to look on the positive side of this. This is probably, hopefully, we'll end up, living in a society that is more connected, more global, more aware of the global challenges, I want to be hopeful, also with less national frontiers.
I'm going to try to not be triggered by your mentions. You've mentioned blockchain, and so has Trent, and you've also mentioned cryptocurrency. I'm going to try not to be triggered by those because I am not a fan of either. But in terms of that,
the price of cryptocurrency has gone up in this process, which is interesting also to see. There has been money printing from the American government, from every government, and that money printing has gone into equities in a pretty artificial way, the rise of the stock market, but also it seems to be going into cryptocurrency. And the thesis of stuff like Bitcoin, which is, I have a lot of disagreements myself with Bitcoin, and I argue all day long on Twitter. But the thesis of if the only government in the world that has not inflated its currency, but actually has deflated its currency, is Bitcoin. Whereas all of the other governments keep printing and printing and printing money, and that will have an impact.
We shouldn't get into an argument about Bitcoin. I think we're being drawn to a close, but can I just say Bitcoin is not deflating its currency, it's still adding currency every 10 minutes, even at a slower rate. But I think we need to stop.
At a slower rate.
So there's no deflation. Thank you to all three of you for that. Sorry for pushing back on the crypto thing there at the end. I couldn't resist. I guess I think we've touched on some interesting things, and I think that the takeaway is just don't do stupid stuff, as Trent said. So thank you all very much.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.